So I don't want to throw shade, but I think it's pretty clear to everyone that there's a lot of garbage information in the fitness industry, like a lot. Just scroll through TikTok, Instagram, whatever, and you'll be assaulted with the barrage of poorly researched junk. But even worse than that, among many of the more respected and influential voices in the fitness space, there seems to be broad-ranging stark disagreement about what constitutes ideal practice for sports performance and injury prevention. Reality is unchanging. What is true, which means some people out there have got to be giving some bad advice, knowingly or not. Knowing who is legit and who isn't is hard, especially for the average person who just wants to know the bare effective minimum and isn't prepared to read hundreds of dry scientific journal articles and try out every purported miracle methodology. Now, how did this happen? Like, genuinely. It's really easy to think that things have always been like this, but if we can understand how we got here, we can learn a number of very useful things about fitness, information ecosystems, and we can find a way out. First, I'll cover the reasons why, and then I'll cover the solution. So, there are 5 key reasons why things ended up like this. 1. Idea pollution in the fitness ecosystem. Think for a moment here about a clean rainforest beach. There's nothing going on in a good way. It's a pristine, untouched natural environment. Then, over time, the surrounding area gets settled. People, maliciously, intentionally or not, leave plastic out on the beach. These plastics, over time, slowly break down. They get into the sand, they get into the soil, then they get into the plants. Soon they're in insects, birds, fish, and then they're basically everywhere. Once it's in the ecosystem, getting it out again feels near impossible. Every single individual element of it spreads it around more. The plastic, for this analogy, is bad advice. Once it's in the ecosystem, it's really hard to get it out of it. People love to share information, but there's no built-in process to ensure that only reliable information gets shared. Like, people are out there still unironically suggesting that doing leg exercises will help you lose leg fat. This problem obviously isn't isolated to the fitness industry alone, but it's particularly evident here. And the next reason will dive more in depth into why that's the case. So, reason 2, the barrier of entry into the fitness space is super low, like really, really low. For comparison, think about the literal science of rockets. Does the average person own one, have an opinion on how to build one, how to repair one, how to make one go faster? No, of course not, because the barrier to entry into this field is sky high. You need an engineering and physics degree minimum before anyone will even begin to take you seriously. In the fitness industry, on the other hand, you can become a certified personal trainer in a couple of weeks of online courses. Starting an Instagram page takes half a minute, and most unfortunately of all, everyone has a body, unlike rockets, and most people have exercised before. And these simple facts combine into one reality, that everyone therefore has an opinion, and a fitness page to boot, freely doling out mountains of often well-meaning, but not very good advice. But what about more trusted professional sources? Surely they're more reliable sources of information. Unfortunately, this is not often the case. Our role models are often not all that they've cracked up to be. So let's look at the 2 groups that contribute to reasons 3 and 4. Movement gurus. Now, these 2 types of guru aren't mutually exclusive, but for the purposes of this video, I'll highlight the weaknesses of both. So, reason 3, the existence of movement practitioner turned guru. Think Ido Portal. These guys or gals are often doing things that most people would consider impossible. The belief that follows is simple. These people are good at movement, therefore, they must know what makes people good at movement. They must know things about movement. They must understand why they're good. This, however, is unfortunately rather flawed logic. I can speak English. I'm great at English. But if you were to ask me a question about English grammar, I couldn't answer it. In fact, I couldn't tell you anything useful at all. Just because I can speak English doesn't mean I understand English grammar and language. In fact, the opposite is often the case. Those who've had to work the hardest to understand something that doesn't come naturally often understand it the best. My non-native English-speaking girlfriend understands and explains English much better than I ever could. The idolization of the most talented movers leads to vast sums of shitty information being spread by diligent admirers and dilettantes. Good athletes are often the worst coaches available unless coaching otherwise similarly gifted athletes. If the pupil is just as blessed movement-wise as they are, the advice that worked for the coach often works for the student, which is often along the lines of telling them to train harder more often or make the right shape instead of the wrong shape. If, however, like most of us, we aren't as gifted, this advice is often worse than useless. If you are a chronically injured bad mover, training harder and more often is not going to help you. So then compound this with the fact that these gurus often have massive egos and don't read any of the existing scientific literature, and you have a fantastic source of information pollution in the ecosystem. Well, surely the opposite of these guys is better, right? Like the highly trained movement academic. And unfortunately, no. Which brings me to reason 4, the academic turned movement guru. Now, this is going to be my most controversial of all my reasons, so if you don't like it, just ignore this one. But like it or not, there is some serious information pollution coming from our academic elites. These guys read a lot, which is great, but it often attracts a certain type of person, a person who's interested in the principles and theory behind movement, rather than their application. Now, this isn't inherently bad, there's nothing wrong with that, but these people often assume that there is little to be learned in the doing, and that the application will take care of itself down the line and is a mere detail. But there is a massive downside to this. For an analogy, think about guitar. How good at guitar can you get? By reading about playing guitar, by understanding guitar theory? How well can you teach others to play guitar having never done it yourself? And the answer is not very. Ultimately, movement and its application are a skill. It has a huge practical, learned, applied element that can't be ignored. The number of physios, exercise scientists, and in between who I've met who are chronically injured and terrible at moving is horrifying. How can you expect to help anyone, teach anyone about movement or rehabilitation if you yourself are just janked up? This point, I guess, is the crucial one. There's an absolute wealth of knowledge to be learned in the applying of many of these theories, in the testing of them, in the playing of the guitar that can never be acquired theoretically. Ultimately, any idea is only as good as its applicability. If you have a theory, an idea, an ideology about how to treat and work with clients and how to teach movement, then you yourself need to apply this and walk the walk. There is just no other way to truly relate to clients, to actually help people. And most unfortunately, what I often see in its stead is mere justification and rationalization as to why it's okay and normal why you're always injured, or why it's perfectly fine and very healthy that you're bad at movement. If all you have is acceptance of pathology, you really don't have much of value to offer. For another analogy here to really beat this point home, taking advice about your body from a chronically injured bad mover is like taking advice about how to not be on fire from someone who's literally on fire. Basically, if they aren't walking the walk themselves, what they're saying is just more pollution for the information ecosystem. And don't get me wrong, this isn't to belittle the scientific process. Ultimately, all ideas and theories must stand up to proper scientific rigor. But at the same time, people, bodies, and movement are notoriously hard to study. There are so many different confounding variables, making this extremely difficult. There are so many differences in methodology and definitions. It's a lot like the field of nutrition. Once you start to really look into it, you start to see that there isn't as much consensus as it may appear from the outside. But yeah, with all that said, there are still good people in this space, and that's, I guess, the reason I'm making this video, is to better help ascertain who they are. But basically, watch out for people who are on fire giving advice about how to not be on fire. And the fifth and final reason, and this one goes mostly at the feet of corporations and money-hungry businesses with an agenda, oversimplified narratives are so much easier to sell to people. Nuanced shades of grey do not condense well into a snappy 15-second Instagram ad. Even if the truth is nuanced, that often doesn't catch on as well as something that is incorrect, but sounds nice and is easy to understand. Ultimately, people latch onto ideas that are easily digestible, make them feel good, and often reinforce their existing worldview. And so, as a result, we get even more plastic information in our ecosystem thanks to our glorious capitalist system. So, to quickly summarize these 5 reasons, information ecosystems, once polluted, are hard to clean up. The barrier to entry for information spreaders is low, and the sources of those informations are often fairly questionable, be it movement guru 3 or 4 or vested commercial interests. All of that causes muddy water, and knowing who to listen to, what interventions actually work, which information is pollution, which isn't, can be very difficult. But there is a way to get our information beached back to its natural tropical beauty. The first fact is we need reliable proxies of information. The average person realistically can't learn the entire field themselves. We do need people to guide us. People who've read the articles, applied the principles, experimented with their own bodies, worked with clients, and ultimately learned things. People we can trust to be mostly right most of the time and lead us in mostly the right direction. So I've come up with a bullshit checklist. A checklist you can apply to your favorite fitness influencer, guru, or advice giver to see if they might know what they're talking about. A TAN checklist, if you will, as well as a secondary, simpler checklist for yourself. These account for the fact that there are multiple ways of knowing things, academic knowledge and applied individual experience, and accounts for competency in understanding injury, performance, and teaching these ideas to others. There are 5 TAN checks in total for others and 1 for yourself. Let's start with the 5 for others first. First check, are they themselves a natural mover? Have they always been pretty good? Did they quickly progress through their chosen sport or discipline and learn new skills easily? Are they now at the top of their chosen discipline or very near the top? The more yeses you can answer this with, the more they fail the first check. These are all pretty good signs that they're a natural, and there is almost no worse teacher than a natural. Most of us suck, and they just don't understand what that's like. Going from not sucking to being good is much rarer and much harder to do. The ideal is someone who was really, really bad, ideally for a really long time, and then had a specific planned intervention, which then resulted in their improvement. Someone like this will know what it means to suck and will actually understand you. But more important than that, they'll also have a way out, a path that you can follow. And also, there are currently plenty of people following an ideology, but if they're still currently sucking, I wouldn't listen to them just yet. Wait until they've had real obvious long-term improvement and then maybe give it a go yourself. Check 2. The same applies to students of the teacher. Often these movement gurus will only work with students who are just as gifted, giving the illusion of passing on excellence rather than just selecting for excellence. This is what happens in many traditional sports like gymnastics. Sign up 500 new kids every year, send them into the meat grinder, and then select the few kids that survive for the competitive program. This isn't coaching, this is just selective sampling. The best teachers work with all students, and if they can show marked improvement in these worst students, then they really passed. If they're just working with excellent students, they fail. Basically, we want evidence of the ability to replicate the success they had with themselves. Check 3. Did they themselves suffer from a history of chronic injuries that they then solved with a specific planned intervention? This is kind of self-explanatory, but you actually want someone who's been injured, ideally a lot. A lot of people who are great movers or just naturally pretty gifted have no idea what it's like to wake up in pain or to try the simplest movement and get pain straight away. If they don't understand pain and haven't really experienced it, it's unlikely that they're going to be able to help you resolve yours. Not necessarily the case, but it's definitely something to be aware of. If they've lived almost entirely injury-free throughout their life, that's a fail. Ideally, someone's been injured lots and now isn't. That's a pass. Check 4. Same thing applies to students. Can they reproduce these results demonstratively? Can they take a student, any student, who's experiencing pain and help them find a way out? If not, that's a fail. If yes, pass. Check 5. Are they familiar with the existing scientific literature? They don't necessarily have to agree with everything, but they have to have at least read it. Do they not make claims that obviously contradict known findings? Do they understand how basic study design works and methodological weaknesses and flaws? If no, that's a fail. If yes, pass. Okay, let's quickly look at some examples of applying these 5 checks to your favorite influencer. And as a quick disclaimer, I'm not actually the most familiar with these people. These are literally just examples, so do your own due diligence. Okay, first, my boy, Idal Potal. Sorry for the pronunciation. Check 1. Was he always moving at a fairly high level? Was he a natural? And in my opinion, he was, so fail. Check 2. Were his students also fairly high level before meeting him? Fail again. He often specifically selects for extremely high level students already. Check 3. Did he have a long history of injury prior to adopting a specific intervention for them? No, not as far as I'm aware, unless you count saying be a generalist. Check 4. Has he then successfully applied this intervention to his students? Honestly, I have no idea on this one. Check 5. Are they familiar with the existing scientific literature and at least reference it? I don't know, maybe. I haven't listened to enough of him to answer this, but my impression is definitely no. And this probably isn't the best example because obviously I'm a little biased here, so do your own due diligence on this one. I probably actually haven't listened to enough of his material to accurately answer these questions. So based on this and check, should we listen to Ido Portal for movement advice? No, not unless we were already a fairly high level mover who wants to be a bit better, who doesn't have a history of chronic injuries and doesn't mind being told to be a generalist. Okay, next example, knees over toes guy. Check 1. Was he always moving at a fairly high level? No, he wasn't good, but he wasn't terrible either, so half and half on this one. Check 2, does he allow a broad range of students? Yeah, seems like anyone's allowed in, so pass on this. Step 3, chronic injury, specific intervention, yes and yes. Nice work, knees over toes guy. But worth bearing in mind, this is fairly niche and specific to one of his problems, just his knees thing, so may not be generally applicable. Check 4, has he then successfully applied this for others? Again, seems like yes sometimes, although not everyone. Check 5, does he read? Honestly, no idea. I haven't listened to enough of his stuff to comment on this. So, should we listen to his movement advice? Maybe if we have knee problems. He's definitely a better alternative than my boy Ido, that's for sure. Now, at this point you might be asking, isn't it a little biased to design a checklist named after yourself that you yourself pass? And you'd be right if I was going to pass it. Check 1, was I good at movement? Hell no. I sucked for the longest time. And this wasn't just beginner sucking. This was me trying my absolute best to be good sucking. The best kind, so pass. Check 2, And here's why I failed the thing. Currently, I haven't obviously documented any of my students' progress online. So there's really no way to verify for yourself if my interventions, which worked for me, work for you. So fail for now. I do expect this to change this year. I plan on posting a lot more of that type of content. But yeah, currently. Check 3. Was I an injured boy? Hells yes, the most injured boy you've ever met for the longest time. Specifically planned intervention to resolve said injuries? Yes. Pass again. Nice work, Theo. Check 4. And another fail. I currently really haven't been focused on documenting my students' progress and putting that online. It's not actually as easy as you might imagine it to do, so big props for anyone out there who is doing this. You need to get consent, make sure people aren't being taken advantage of, get someone else to film. There's a lot to it. Check 5, can I read? Yes, I have some degrees in this stuff and I'm a big fat nerd, but I don't necessarily agree with everything I read, but I've certainly read it. So 3 out of 5, not bad. Consider listening to this person, but maintain some healthy skepticism. What works for me may not necessarily work for you for some unforeseen reason until I've documented this more thoroughly. So, okay, now the last final tan check, the easiest one, and this one is for yourself. Before you spread information to others about how to not be on fire, are you yourself on fire? If you're currently deeply injured and terrible at movement and are posting lots of stuff on the internet, the stuff you are posting is probably just spreading around someone else's ideology or pollution. Each individual needs to check for themselves. Are we following an ideology in spite of the fact that we're consistently chronically injured and bad at moving? Look at the results of your practice. If they aren't working, you need to change things. Try looking for people who passed the previous 5 checks, listening to them for a while, learning and applying the information, and then seeing if you get results. And then, and only then, spreading that information around. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening to that one, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Peace out.